So welcome everybody. It's delightful to see you here this morning. Pay close attention to why we're here, because you are going to have to fill in the friends that come after you, because you know they're coming. So our purpose today is to explore the psychological roots of our differences and to learn some practical skills for navigating them. And by practical skills for navigating them, we mean specifically how to talk to people that you don't necessarily agree with and who don't agree with you. So we are thrilled and delighted to welcome Carolyn Mell today. She is the co-founder and director for Open Mind. It's a group that uses research and science to help people understand why we have all of these challenges that we do, and then brings skills and tools to educational groups and companies to help them overcome those differences together. We're thrilled that you're all here. And with that, before I turn this over to Carolyn, I have a request for everybody on the call right this minute. Here in the Meeting Innovation community, it is our goal to learn how to run better meetings at work, what works, what doesn't, which means we need your feedback. So because I know some of you will leave at the top of the hour or you'll forget, I would love it if you would open the feedback form right now. Just go ahead and click the link, and then you'll have that open in a tab. And when you are inspired to give us feedback, it'll be ready for you and you'll never forget because it's right there. All right, thank you. Hi, Andrew. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Miyuki. Tawana, Daphne, lovely to see you all. And I'll turn it over to Carolyn. Thank you, Carolyn, for being here.
Yeah, well, Elise, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. It's great to be with you all today. As Elise mentioned, my name is Carolyn Mell, and I'm the co-founder and executive director of Open Mind. And we're a nonprofit organization that builds educational tools to help people bridge their differences. And I co-founded the organization with the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who some of you might be familiar with. He's written a couple of best-selling books like The Righteous Mind, The Coddling of the American Mind. And he's one of the lead thinkers in understanding why it is we're so divided in our current times and what we can do about that. So to share a little bit more about just, who we are and how we got started, John and I started the organization in the aftermath of the 2016 US presidential election, as we were growing increasingly concerned about rising polarization and social division, and essentially just recognizing that we had started to grow so far apart that we had almost lost a common language, lost the ability to communicate across our differences. And I know we have some people around the world on this call. And so, of course, these issues are not just isolated to the US. We're seeing the same types of trends in a lot of countries around the world. And we know that these trends are having a lot of negative impacts on our society and even in the organizations that we work with. So it's impacting us on a national level and an international level, but it's also starting to seep into, our private relationships, our local communities and the companies where we're working every day. And so we see how there's been an increase in conflict. This also leads to, within the workplace, a fear of speaking up, decreased belonging, decreased team effectiveness. And so we're really concerned about these different challenges. And especially, I'm sure a lot of you on this call are familiar with this data, but we know from research that having belonging in the workplace is really important for team performance, motivation, and engagement. And so there's research that shows that belonging leads to a 56% increase in performance, 75% decrease in sick days, and 50% reduction in turnover. So this reduction in belonging as a result of our internal divisions is really having a significant impact in our workplaces. So John and I were really concerned about all these trends, how it was impacting all these different types of institutions, and we wanted to do something about it. And what we recognized also was that there was so much great research in the behavioral sciences about why it is we're so divided, why, we have this inability to communicate across our differences, and what that means about how we can actually learn to navigate our differences more effectively. But unfortunately, even though there was this research, it was really inaccessible for a lot of people. It, was often kind of trapped in the ivory tower of academia where people didn't really have access to it. People weren't familiar with it. And so we decided that we wanted to bring that research to life and translate it into learning tools that were engaging, evidence-based, practical, and scalable. So we launched Open Mind to do just that. And so our mission at Open Mind is to equip people with the habits of heart and mind to bridge divides. And our main offering is a blended learning tool, which I'll share a little bit more about later on. And so because it's online learning, we've been able to grow quite a bit. And over the last couple of years, we've grown to reach more than 50,000 learners across the United States, but even in countries around the world. And so we've been used in a variety of institutions. We primarily work within higher education, but we also work in workplaces, local government, with nonprofits, philanthropies, basically wherever there are people that are having these problems. And so we're trying to help them. So I'm really excited to be with you all here today and to share some of the insights that we talk about in our work in this session. So to get started, I'm just going to briefly review the agenda for today's session. So I'm going to start off by establishing some, there seems to be a little delay, but we're going to start off with establishing some group norms. And then the bulk of the session today is going to be focused on answering two main questions. So the first question is, how is it possible that two people can look at the same set of facts and reach different conclusions? And the second is, where do our differences in values and worldviews come from? And then I'm going to share a little bit of an overview of Open Mind, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So with that, just to get us started around session norms, this session is really about, digging deep, exploring more about, ourselves, our own worldviews, our own values, what led us there. And we're going to have a breakout session where I'm going to ask you all to, share a little bit with one another. And so I just want to make sure that we create an environment where people feel really comfortable sharing openly and honestly, and people don't feel as though they're being judged. So I just wanted to establish some norms for us at the outset. So the norms that I'd like to suggest are that we treat everyone with respect, even if you disagree with them. The second is that you give others the benefit of the doubt. So, if you hear something that someone says and you might have an initial reaction, try to withhold that initial judgment and instead react with curiosity and try to seek to understand, where are they coming from? Let me hear them out, or ask a clarifying question to better understand. The third norm is that I would like to ask that others don't interrupt people when they're speaking. So if someone's speaking, please let them finish what they're saying before you respond. And then lastly, to keep these conversations confidential. So if you're in a breakout room, please, respect the privacy of the person that you're sharing with, and only share beyond the breakout room if you have permission from them. So just want to take a quick pulse with the group. If you could use a thumbs up. Do people feel comfortable with these norms? Seeing some thumbs up. Yes. Okay, great. Does anyone have anything that they want to add to this list that would make them feel as though we're creating an environment where people feel more comfortable? No pressure, but just in case, want to give people the space if anyone has anything they want to share. It's looking like people are comfortable with these norms. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. So we can get started. So the first question, as I mentioned, is, how is it possible that two people can look at the same set of facts and reach different conclusions? And to answer this question, we're going to explore the inner workings of the mind and seek to uncover the underlying psychology behind that. So I'm curious, by show of hands, either virtual hands or I guess that's probably easier. Has anyone ever experienced some kind of internal tension where, you felt as though you were internally divided? Maybe you had a deep desire to eat, an extra cookie, but you kind of thought that you might not want to eat it. You might later regret it. Or, have you ever found yourself procrastinating for too long on a deadline? Anyone? Yeah, I see a lot of hands going up. Yeah. So we all have had this experience it's some time in our lives, and there's a reason for it. And it's because one of the greatest truths in psychology is that our minds are divided between two parts that sometimes conflict. Now, this tension has been noted across eras and cultures. So you see it, again, all over the world, all throughout our ancient wisdom cultures, that people talk about this internal division and how hard it can be. And so the reason why we experience this is, again, because there really are two different processes that are operating in the mind. And so there are a couple of different names that some of you might be familiar with around these two different processes, but the terms that I'd like to introduce today are thinking about these two processes as automatic thinking and controlled thinking. So our automatic thinking are all the types of cognitive processes that happen quickly, automatically, unconsciously, and without our intentional control. So this is also where our emotions and intuitions live. So some examples of this are, let's say you're walking down the street and you just, you see your best friend. You're going to instantly recognize your friend. You're not going to have to think about it. Their name is just going to pop into your head. So this is an example of automatic thinking. Similarly, if I ask you to calculate 2 times 2, the answer would just pop into your head. You wouldn't have to, think about what the answer is. But in contrast, we also have controlled thinking. So controlled thinking works in the opposite way. So controlled thinking is slower, it's conscious, it's effortful, it's logical, it's where our complex reasoning happens. So for example, if I asked you to calculate 37 times 26, for most of us, the answer wouldn't be automatic. We would need to, work out the math. So this is the controlled thinking does all of the, higher order processing, the complex logic or reasoning that we're doing, in a lot of our work. So while these two systems are operating all the time, oftentimes, they're working seamlessly. We don't really notice that they're two different systems. But when you have that kind of internal tension pulling you in different directions, it's a reflection of the fact that there really are these two different systems that are in tension. Now, there's a useful metaphor that I'm going to introduce to help us remember these two systems and how they work together. So the metaphor is that you can think about the mind as being like a small human rider sitting on top of a large elephant. And in this metaphor, the elephant represents our automatic thinking and the rider represents our controlled thinking. Now, the reason why this metaphor is useful is because it's kind of the opposite of what you would think. So most of us like to think of ourselves as being highly rational, right? We think we're in control, we're carefully reasoning our way to certain conclusions. And so we want to think that our, big, powerful elephant is what's, the control thinking is what's in control. But instead, what's actually happening is that our automatic thinking, the elephant, where our emotions and intuitions live, is much more powerful than our controlled thinking. And it also moves much quicker. And so if you think about the way, a small human rider sitting on top of an elephant might operate, the rider has the ability to look further into the future. So the rider can, make a plan. And that's how our controlled thinking works. We can make, deliberate plan. We're going to exercise every month or every day this month, for a certain period of time. But the elephant, our emotions and intuitions, our automatic system is far more powerful. And so it can take us off course. It has a 6-ton advantage. So we all know that experience of having made a plan with our controlled thinking and then being, driven off the course by some other kind of deep impulse. And this process happens with all of our thinking and decision making. And it happens so quickly and so seamlessly that we're left with the illusion of rationality. We're left with the illusion that we're carefully reasoning our way to whatever decision is that we're making. But in fact, it's often our emotions and intuitions that are playing a very powerful role in shaping that. So I'm going to do a quick exercise to show this in action. And so throughout the course of this session, we're going to do some live polling. So this will be the first time we'll do it. So I'm going to introduce a scenario, and then you'll see a QR code afterwards to vote anonymously. So the scenario is, imagine that you were desperately in need of a new car and you went to a used car lot and you found this, fantastic car. It's at a great price, in great condition, and you're able to drive it off the lot today. And you're about to make the purchase and you open up the glove compartment and you see that there's some paperwork that shows that the former owner of the car was a well-known serial killer. So the question is, would you buy this car? So I'm going to pull up, hopefully, if you want to just take out your cell phone, you can pull up this QR code and then vote. And then we'll be using the same QR code throughout the presentation. So if you want to leave that tab open in your phone. So the question is, would you buy this car after learning that it was previously owned by a well-known serial killer? So we'll take a minute for people to vote. Okay, let's see. Interesting. Okay, 100% of you said that you would not buy this car. So that's typical that most people say they wouldn't buy the car. This is I've never seen 100%. That's great. So I'm just curious if anyone wants to unmute themselves and share, I guess everyone on the call said they wouldn't buy the car. So could someone share, why is it that you wouldn't buy the car?
I was wavering between both. The yes side of me was like the logical side of saying, like, why does it matter? It's just a car. But then the other side is like, well, now you seem to be like, I don't know, it kind of feels like you're a little complicit.
Interesting. Great. Thanks for sharing, Scott. And then Jen, do you want to share?
Yeah, it was an emotional reaction for me, and I just went with it. But I think when I think about it, things that you have in your life hold meaning, and you want to ensure the meaning around those things makes you feel good, right? And so if there's like some knowledge around a thing that you own that kind of taints that meaning or makes it feel off-putting, then I feel like that draws energy and focus away from you. And every time you look at that car, you're just going to be thinking about serial killers, which is draining. It takes energy away from your life. So that's something that I personally would want to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, so it's interesting that, both of you talked about these emotions, and Jenny, you used some really interesting language around like tainting it and just like creating this feeling that would make you, you didn't use the word uncomfortable, but I think that's what you were suggesting. And that's really what most people say, right? So most people say they wouldn't want to buy the car, and they often say things similarly to what you both said, where there's something that just feels really wrong about it. It's just uncomfortable. There's bad energy. There's just something that's off about this whole situation. And, of course, that's the point of the example, to evoke that, very strange sensation, and to create that kind of contradiction between like, there's part of you that feels like there's something very wrong about this, but there's also something that you can't totally justify because, maybe in another way it could be fine. So again, this is an illustration of the fact that our emotions and intuition, that's that deep feeling that there's something wrong or icky about this car. Those are very, very powerful, and they really help shape the way that we interpret the world around us. And so an important insight from psychology is that the way that we make decisions or evaluate the world around us is that our intuitions come first and our strategic reasoning comes second. And so what I mean by that is that as we're going about the world, we're constantly encountering different things, and we have these automatic reactions to everything. And these are that's our automatic thinking, our automatic emotions and intuitions that forms a kind of snap judgment about whatever it is we encounter. And then our slower system, our controlled thinking, comes along afterwards and creates what are known as post hoc rationalizations to defend our initial intuitions. So our controlled thinking controls our verbal reasoning. So all these, elaborate explanations that we can come up with to explain why we feel this way, to explain why we've reached this conclusion, that's coming after we've already reached the conclusion. So again, this is happening all the time, and these two systems can lead to a variety of what are known as cognitive biases, which I imagine a lot of you are familiar with. So cognitive biases are these consistent and predictable mistakes in our reasoning and judgment. And so two common cognitive biases that a lot of you are probably hearing recently is our confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. So confirmation bias, and these two things are very similar. So confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out and interpret information in a way that confirms what we already want to believe. And similarly, motivated reasoning is when we are motivated to reach a certain type of conclusion, and then we again look at evidence in such a way to help justify the conclusion that we wanted to reach. Now, what's happening in both cases is that we're beginning with the conclusion. Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay with the animation, but so we begin with the conclusion, and then we're using evidence to justify, hopefully it'll come up in a second, to justify the conclusion that we had already begun with at the outset. So we're essentially using evidence in a backwards fashion to justify our initial intuitions as opposed to going the other direction. And of course, this isn't, always the case. We don't have to fall prey to this all the time. And being more aware of the fact that we have these tendencies can help us override that powerful elephant. But this is, again, like the default settings of how the mind works. So the Harvard psychologist Dan Gilbert has a great quote that summarizes these tendencies, which I really love. Which is, he says, "When our bathroom scale delivers bad news, we hop off and then on again, just to make sure we didn't misread the display or put too much pressure on one foot. When our scale delivers good news, we smile and head for the shower. By uncritically accepting evidence when it pleases us and insisting on more when it doesn't, we subtly tip the scales in our favor." And again, I think we can all, relate to that in some way, where when we get an answer that we like, we just accept it. We're like, great, that's exactly what I thought. But if you get an answer you don't like, you're a lot more skeptical and critical. And so you start to, dissect the evidence and question it. And so we hold evidence to very different standards based on whether we want to believe something or if we don't want to believe something. And again, this helps explain why two different people can look at the same set of facts and reach different conclusions. Because when people look at the same information, their intuitions are guiding them in different directions. They'll either discount certain pieces of evidence or, prioritize them even more based on what their initial intuitions are. So the question then remains, well, why is it that we have different intuitions to begin with? Why is it that one person leans in one direction and another person leans in another direction? So that's what we'll focus on answering now by uncovering the roots of our differing worldviews. So to get started, I'm going to do another quick exercise, which again, many of you are probably familiar with. So a lot of you have probably heard this famous clip, and I'm going to play this clip where people tend to hear either Yanny or Laurel. So after I play the clip again, we're going to do some live polling, and I'm just going to see, what did people hear in this audio clip? So take a listen, remember what you heard, and then you'll vote.
Laurel, 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 Laurel.
Okay. So if you could pull up your QR codes again and then indicate what you heard. Okay, so about half the group hears Laurel and about half the group hears Yanny, which is very typical. So again, this is this strange audio clip that is very low quality. It's very fuzzy. And so what's happening here is that the mind is a pattern matcher. Basically, as we're going throughout the world, we're constantly being inundated with new information, new stimulus, and our brain has to work at lightning speed in order to interpret the world around us and make sense of it. Otherwise, we'd be totally baffled. And so what happens is that, again, our automatic system, our elephant, works instantaneously to impose some kind of pattern on the world around us. And when we experience something that's somewhat ambiguous, the mind starts to get a little bit confused. But again, the mind still has to make meaning of it, because if it didn't, we would just be totally bewildered all the time. So the mind quickly imposes a pattern to say, like, this is what we're hearing, either Yanny or Laurel. And once we impose that pattern, it can then be very, very difficult to see the information in a different way. And so this happens, in cases like this, where there's, it's pretty unimportant. There's a fuzzy audio clip, and so we're hearing it in different ways. But it also happens with much more important things like ambiguous and important moral and political issues. So again, whenever something is a little bit ambiguous, people have the opportunity to interpret it differently, but we become convinced that our way of interpreting it is completely correct. So as Albert Einstein said, reality is merely an illusion, albeit a persistent one. So we all have this kind of perception that we're experiencing the world completely objectively, right? We all think that as we're going throughout the world, what we experience, what we see is reality. But unfortunately, that's not the case. What's really happening is that we each are interpreting reality subjectively through our own personal lenses, which are again informed by our deep intuitions. But we have this perception that whatever we've seen is completely objective and accurate. And what makes this even more challenging is that when we go throughout the world, we're also part of what are known as moral communities. So we tend to live and work and surround ourselves with people who share the same worldviews and values as us, who see the world very similarly than us, who prioritize the same things. And as a result, what happens is that these different moral communities reinforce our perception that our view of reality is accurate. And so we become even further convinced that, of course, what I'm seeing and the way that I'm thinking about this is right, because everyone around me thinks the same way. But what's actually happening is it's almost as though, imagine you're living in a community of people who happen to hear Laurel in that audio clip. And there are other groups of people where everyone in the group of people only heard Yanni. So everyone in that group would be totally convinced that there was only one way to hear that audio clip. And then when they came into contact with one another, they would be baffled. They would say, like, what are you talking about? How could you hear Yanni? How could you hear Laurel? It's obviously one or the other. And everyone I know thinks the same way. So there's like something totally crazy going on here. I can't make sense of this. And so this is a nice, illustration of what we're experiencing in our society around much more, again, significant issues around political and moral issues, where we're interpreting the reality in a particular way. Those around us tend to interpret it similarly. And so then when we come in contact with people from different moral communities, it's very hard to make sense of how they're seeing things differently than us. So the question then remains, well, again, why do these different moral communities form? Why do they see things differently? So to answer that question, I'm going to introduce a second metaphor. So the metaphor is that, let's see. Seems like the slide is loading very slowly, but hopefully it'll come up in a second. So the metaphor is that the mind is like a tongue with 6 taste receptors. So if you think about the human tongue, we all share the same 5 taste receptors. We have salty, sour, sweet, bitter, and savory. So even though we all have the same taste receptors in our tongue, we all have different taste preferences. So for example, different cuisines or different cultures will have very different cuisines. Even within any given culture, any given family, people will have different taste preferences. And so the reason that this happens is that we all begin with the same taste receptors due to our common evolutionary heritage. But then we build upon these taste receptors in different ways based on a combination of factors like the culture that we grow up in, our childhood socialization, and our particular life experiences. So even though we begin with the same taste receptors, we end up with different taste preferences and profiles. So psychologists believe that morality works in a similar way, where we all begin with the same universal set of what are known as moral foundations. And so moral foundations can be thought of as the building blocks for morality, in the same way that our taste receptors are the building blocks of taste. So we all have pre-prepared in our minds these almost like receptors for morality, and then we rely on them or combine them in different ways and to different degrees based on a combination of factors like our culture, childhood socialization, and life experiences. And so the 6 moral foundations, which you can think of as these kind of broad categories of values and morality, are care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. And so essentially, my colleague John Haidt, he had set out to make sense of, again, why is it that there's so many commonalities in our morality and our moral senses, but there are also these profound differences. So he looked out at research across a variety of disciplines like cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology, anthropology, religion, and he looked to see, where are there commonalities, again, where there are these common trends across these different cultures and traditions, and how do they align with different aspects of our evolutionary heritage. And what he found was that there are these, again, 6 commonalities. And what's really interesting about this is you might look at this list and say that, there's a value that I care a lot about, I don't see here. But the idea here is that these are kind of like meta categories from which all other values can be derived. So if there's a specific value that you care a lot about, let's say honesty or family, these values trace back to one of these big categories. So I'm going to explain what each of these foundations mean a little bit more. And what we're also going to do is we're going to do some live polling for each one so you can get a better sense of, how does this actually show up in my day-to-day life? So we'll get started with the CARE Foundation. So the CARE Foundation underlies notions of empathy, compassion, caring for others, and wanting to prevent people from experiencing harm. So we're going to do the first example. And what I'm also just going to say is that each example is, it's like it's a binary where I'm going to force you to answer like yes or no, agree, disagree. And I just want to acknowledge that a lot of these questions are much more complex than just a simple yes or no, but we'll just, please bear with me just for the sake of an illustration that we'll withhold that nuance just for illustrating this. And also what we'll see is that these questions are really meant to elicit strong reactions in certain cases. So just be prepared for that. So the first question is, And if you want to pull up the QR code in the meantime. So imagine as your team has grown accustomed to working remotely during the pandemic, some employees want to continue working from home to make childcare easier. What would you do if you could control this? Would you insist that all employees return to in-person work, or would you offer flexibility to allow employees to work remotely if they choose? So if you want to just take a moment to vote. Okay, let's see. Interesting. Okay, so 90% of people say that they would offer the flexibility to allow people to work remotely if they choose. So what's interesting here is that those who are answering in that way, they're relying more strongly on the CARE Foundation in this particular example, where they're showing more care for their employees. But what's interesting is that while 90% of the group feels this way, 10% of the group disagrees. So interesting to see that we have, again, a variety in opinion in this group. So now let's move on to the second foundation. So the second foundation is the Fairness Foundation. So the Fairness Foundation underlies notions of, fairness across how people in systems should be treated. So we all have this deep desire for people to behave in an ethical way. We don't want to be cheated. We don't want to see other people be cheated. And we want systems to operate fairly. Now, what's really interesting is that across the political spectrum, people on the political left and the political right both care about fairness, but people tend to interpret fairness differently based on their political preferences. So those on the political left tend to think about fairness more as equality or equity, where they really prioritize this idea of equal outcomes. That's their conception of fairness. Whereas people on the political right tend to think about fairness in terms of proportionality, meaning that people should get out in proportion to what they put in, what they contribute. So it's just an interesting illustration of the fact that, again, there's so much diversity within these foundations where people can still prioritize the same foundation, but start to think about it or apply it differently. So in this next situation, the question is, should all employees at a company be entitled to the same paid time off policy, regardless of how long they've been with the company? Okay, let's see. Okay, so 63% of 70% of people say yes, everyone should have the same paid time off, and 30% say no. So again, this is just an interesting reflection of the fact that people who are saying yes are leaning more towards fairness as equality, where people have equal outcomes, where they all have the same paid time off, whereas those who are answering no are leaning more towards fairness in the situation as proportionality, where people who have been at the company longer should have more time off. So interesting, again, to see that this is a situation where people are leaning differently. Their intuitions are different about this. So now let's move on to the third foundation, which is the Liberty Foundation. So the Liberty Foundation underlies notions of freedom, rights, and not wanting to be oppressed or controlled. So again, what's interesting is that people across the political spectrum care about liberty, but research shows that, again, political conservatives and political liberals tend to interpret or apply the Liberty Foundation differently. So those on the political right tend to think about liberty in terms of freedom from government control or regulation, whereas people on the political left tend to think about liberty as wanting to protect more vulnerable groups from oppression from other groups. So again, interesting that both care about it, but they're starting to apply it differently. So now let's take a look at an example about the Liberty Foundation. So the example here is, should the government be allowed to restrict the number of people who can gather in your private home during a pandemic? Yes or no? Okay, let's see the responses. Interesting. Okay, so the group is pretty split here. Oh, okay, exactly split. So half the people say yes, half the people say no. And again, it's just an interesting illustration of the fact that this group is diverse and is reacting differently to this prompt. So now let's move on to the fourth foundation, which is the Loyalty Foundation. So the Loyalty Foundation underlies notions of any kind of in-group loyalty. So this could refer to loyalty to your family, to your friends, to your community, to your religion, to the company that you work at, to your alma mater. It can even expand out to loyalty to your country, meaning patriotism. So now let's take a look at a loyalty example. So the question here is, imagine that your sibling committed a serious crime and you have the evidence to prove it. Would you tell the authorities? Okay, let's see the results. Okay, interesting. So 60% of the group said that they would tell the authorities, or now we're getting more split to around 50-50. So again, those who are saying that they would tell the authorities are less relying on the loyalty foundation in this particular case. And those who say they wouldn't tell the authorities, that's stemming from this feeling of loyalty to their sibling. So again, interesting to see that on every question so far, we're seeing a lot of diversity in opinion. So now let's move on to the fifth foundation. So the fifth foundation is the authority foundation. And the authority foundation underlies notions of having respect for traditions, established institutions, and legitimate forms of power. It can also apply to people that you believe are worthy of your respect. So now let's take a look at a question about the authority foundation. So the question is, which value do you think is more important to inculcate in children? Respect for elders or creativity? Okay, let's see. And again, the group is totally split 50-50. Interesting. So, so in this case, those who are answering respect for elders might be slightly higher in authority in this particular case, whereas those who are answering for creativity are leaning a little bit away from it. So interesting again to see that there is diversity in this group on these questions. So now we'll move on to the last foundation, which is the Sanctity Foundation. So the Sanctity Foundation underlies the sense that there are certain things that are sacred and pure and should be treated as such. And so this can apply to a lot of different things. So it can apply to sacred symbols and objects, for example, like holy objects, holy books, holy places. It can also apply to sacred symbols like national flags. But at the same time, people also think about this in relation to, for example, their own bodies, where they might think of the body as being like a temple that they want to make sure is pure. And so they're very careful about what they eat. And so even language that we use around, certain types of diets, talk about things like, wanting to detox or like avoid certain toxins. And this is, again, tapping into this idea of the Sanctity Foundation, or, trying to avoid foods that have GMOs in it, again, as an example of this sanctity feeling. So we're going to do the last question. This one is probably the most controversial. And again, this is really just meant to elicit strong reactions to test, whether people are feeling more or less strongly about the Sanctity Foundation in this case. So, so let's see how people feel about this one. So the last question is, imagine your neighbor cuts up an old American flag and uses it to clean their bathroom. No one saw them do it. Did they do something wrong? And if you're not American, you can think about your own national flag and answer according to that. Okay, interesting. So once again, the group is pretty split. So about half the group says that someone did something wrong and half the group didn't. So for those who are saying that someone did something wrong, it's because, again, this idea that the national flag is inherently sacred. It's a reflection of sacred values about our country. And so regardless of if someone saw them do it, there's something inherently wrong. Whereas those who answered no are, not feeling as strongly about that. So again, interesting to see that these questions, again, are all meant to really elicit what are some of these deep intuitions that people have about these different questions. And the fact that we're moving so quickly, there's no room for nuance. It's really trying to get a snapshot of like, what are those intuitions that you all have. And again, fascinating to see that the group has been pretty divided on almost every single issue. So it's a nice reflection of the fact that people are interpreting the foundations differently. So again, as we mentioned, we all have these same 6 foundations. These are, we're using them and applying them in different ways and to different degrees with all these different complex topics that we encounter in the world. And we each rely on them differently based on a variety of factors. Now, what's really interesting is that understanding the moral foundations can really help us make sense of our political divides. So what researchers have found is researchers asked hundreds of thousands of people all over the world a set of questions measuring their reliance on the different moral foundations. And they found this reliable pattern where liberals and conservatives tend to rely on different foundations to different degrees. So what we see here is on the left side of the graph, those are people who are much further on the political left. And people who are further on the political left tend to care a lot about fairness, care, and liberty, whereas they don't tend to prioritize authority, sanctity, and loyalty. But as you start to go more towards the political right, you see that things change a lot, where people on the political right, they do care about fairness and care, but to a lesser extent, but they care a lot about liberty, authority, and sanctity. And And what's interesting is that while this sample is just looking at a snapshot of Americans, these same patterns have been found around the world. So people on the political left and political right around the world tend to prioritize these different moral foundations to different extents. And so this really helps us make sense of, in our current climate, we sometimes feel as though we're like talking right past one another. And the reason for it is that to a large extent we are. Our moral foundations really start, once you understand this is like a pattern you can see everywhere. It shows up in the language that we use, the things that we prioritize, the policies that we prioritize. And so what's happening is, there's this kind of mismatch or gap because oftentimes what's happening is when there's some kind of, big debate, there are two different values that are being pitted against one another. And so one person is really prioritizing one value and another person is really prioritizing another value. And it's really hard for us to see it from the other perspective. But what's useful about moral foundations theory is it helps us recognize that, first of all, we all are coming from this shared set of universal foundations. So even though we might have really strong opinions about something, it's useful to recognize that, someone from the other side is probably not driven by, malicious intent or, some poor motivations. They are likely just as sincere as we are about what we value, but they are, landing in a certain place because they have certain values that they're prioritizing more than us. And what this also helps us recognize is that we have the capacity to understand where other people are coming from, because other people, again, they're all building on this based off of different foundations and values that we also have access to. So a useful way for us to think about this is that we all, again, begin with the same moral foundations. And the way in which we rely on these different foundations causes us to have different interpretations of what the good society looks like. So different people have different visions of the good society, where one person will think, a good society looks like this. Another person thinks a good society looks like that, again, based on their preference for different values. And then these differences in visions about what the good society looks like leads us to have different policy preferences. And so very often in our, contemporary debates, we get so caught up on these questions around policy, and we're debating at the level of policy. And what's really important and useful for us to recognize is that our policy preferences, again, reflect these deeper values and priorities. And so it can be really helpful to dig beneath the surface and get curious about, why is it that you care about this policy? Like, what are the values that are driving you in this situation? And that can help us, you don't necessarily need to agree with one another, but it can really help us foster more understanding for why someone might feel very differently than us. And it can help us move forward and find common ground. So what's also important for us to recognize is that we each have this individual hierarchy of foundations and values and issues. So all of us have, there's certain foundations, there's certain values that we prioritize more, we care more about. There's certain issues that we care a lot about. And the issues and the values that we care about are often a reflection of our particular life experiences. So we each might feel, very, very strongly about particular issues. And when we feel that strongly about it, again, we can find it very challenging to understand, why does someone not care about this? Or why does someone feel differently about this? Like, it doesn't make sense. Or we might, again, start to leap to, really negative assumptions about people, about why, how could you not care about this issue? This is the most important issue of our time. Or how could you not agree with me on this issue? This is, my fundamental issue. And what's important to recognize is that because so much of this is driven by our personal life experiences, other people might feel the exact same way about other issues, and feel like, again, why don't we prioritize the issues they care about? What's also interesting and important to recognize is that even if people have similar life experiences, that doesn't mean that people will react the same way to them. So just as a personal example, my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. And I know that a lot of people who are the descendants of Holocaust survivors, that is, an important piece of their identity, and it shapes the way they see the world. But at the same time, different people will react very differently to that. Whereas some people might then say, I really prioritize caring for refugees because I understand what it was like to be, for my ancestors to be refugees. Whereas others might feel very differently. They might say, I really prioritize having a strong and secure state of Israel because, my ancestors were persecuted and this is what's important to me. And so it's just, again, interesting and useful to recognize that our life experiences will lead us in these different directions. And so it's important for us to try to step outside ourselves and question, when we feel so strongly about something and someone we encounter feels differently, to start to question, okay, well, what's driving me to feel this way? And what might have been different in their life to lead them in a different direction? And then start to really get curious and tease some of those things out in the conversation, as opposed to, shutting down or, assuming bad intentions or assuming bad things about the other person. So with that, we're going to do a breakout activity where we're going to give everyone the opportunity to reflect on some of these ideas. So what I'm going to ask is that you each take a moment to think privately about the following questions, and then we're going to split up into pairs where you'll have the opportunity to share with your partner, and then we'll come back together as a full group. So what I'd like you to think about is, what's an issue you care deeply about? What are the foundations that underlie your views on this issue? What life experiences informed your views on the issue? And how do you think your views might have differed had you not had those particular life experiences? So if you could all, again, take a moment to just think privately about that. And then Elise is going to open up the breakout rooms. And she's also going to share a link that will open up the slide or share the prompts so that you can have it open while you're in the breakout rooms. So we can just take a minute for people to reflect on these questions. Okay, so Elise, you're welcome to open up the breakout rooms whenever you're ready. And so we'll have about 10 minutes in the breakout rooms. So please take about 5 minutes per person to share with one another and have some discussion.
Welcome back. Welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's see, is everyone back? Looks like it, more or less. Okay, well, would love to just open up the space for people to share. I'm curious if anyone wants to share either what their responses were to these questions, any insights that came to mind from reflecting on these, any insights that came out just from the conversation, whether there were commonalities or differences. So if you want to use the hand raising function, it would be great to just hear from the group what's on everyone's mind.
Hi. Well, I had a great conversation and we were really similarly aligned, I think, on, the things that we probably care about are our foundational views. I think we're very similar. I chose equity as my number one, as an issue I care deeply about. And then I said that the foundations that underlie that were care, fairness, and liberty. And my life experiences that have informed my views on this issue comes a lot from living in the skin that I have, and also living internationally. So having to see myself through the lens and views of other people in other countries, and also now to be looking at America from a perspective that's sort of outside of the space. And so that's been a really interesting journey. And I think if I hadn't have moved overseas and encountered so many different other cultures and perspectives, and learning about how people view me as an American, or how people might view me as a Black American, or asking me questions about myself that I would never get asked in America. I feel like all of those things really shaped, and there's a lot more to it than that, but those are some main things that have shaped my life experiences. And currently, as you can see, it's getting dark behind me, so I'm not in America, but I'm in South Africa. So living in a country that's majority Black and being a country who's coming out of apartheid only 25 years ago, the whole idea around equity and injustices and things, I think, is really interesting being in this space. So I don't think I would have developed those views if I had not lived in different cultures aside from my own.
That's fascinating. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, great to hear how living abroad has influenced your perspective. That's really interesting. Miyoki, sorry if I'm mispronouncing anyone's name, but yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, this is Miyuki, and Andrea and I had a very good reflection, and I think these 4 questions, the structure of the questions and the understanding of the foundation were very good guidance to bring up our reflection. And particularly the number 4 question, if I didn't have the experience question, was put myself in other people's shoes, and also how much I appreciate my experience, and how we are learning from experience, and that leads to our foundation to understand the process. I truly enjoyed this exercise. Thank you.
I'm so glad. That's great. And if you feel comfortable, do you want to share anything about, what you reflected on in this exercise, or what the 4th question helped you kind of reflect on?
Well, my the care, the issue was like limited, young people nowadays are limited access to the education, which I was in a similar situation, but I were opportunity to go on to higher education with a scholarship or other, funding. So the maybe care, fairness, and that gave me a lot of liberty. So these we talked about around those foundations.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else have anything they want to share? Any insights or reflections?
I do. I'm Barb.
Yeah, sure.
The person I talked with shared a little piece about if she hadn't had the experience, if she hadn't learned from other people the practical implications of that are different from the theory, she would have just had the theory, but because of her experience, then she, had different views. And I would take that a little bit farther. For me, not only did I get the different practice, the different viewpoint from the practice, but because I had conversations with people, I developed a relationship, and then now I have a loyalty to those people that I feel like I need to defend against any of the theory that would harm them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That just that deepening of connection has informed the strength of that issue to you. And I'm curious, do you have any insights about how you might feel differently had you not had those particular experiences or built those relationships, or did that prompt anything for you?
Oh, absolutely. It changed my mind about one particular topic.
Very
because I grew up, based on a theory or a way of looking at the world. And when I met people that didn't have that theory, or, who were living in a completely different way, and I really listened to them, then I understood why that theory did. I questioned the theory as truth. The theory was presented as truth, and now I don't accept it as truth anymore.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. And, what you just said really connects back to a lot of the themes that we've been talking about in this session about how we can, be in environments where people accept something as truth, and then you're suddenly in a different environment and people question that, and that can cause you to question it. And I saw that some people were asking questions in the chat about how much do we change, what influences us to change. And all of the things that people are talking about here, like, living abroad, encountering people who think differently, really taking the time to understand where they're coming from. Like, these are these really impactful life experiences that can really shape or shift our intuitions and emotions. And so it's also valuable to think about this is an effective way to connect with other people when we disagree with them, by really digging deep into these types of questions can help us elicit more connection and understanding. Jen, do you want to share something with the group?
Yeah, I think this conversation is just making me think about or just reflect on how are the moral foundations and experiences actually intertwined and can almost reinforce and compound each other. Because if you have certain moral foundations, you might be kind of going back to the beginning of this, looking for experiences that build on or like reinforce those moral foundations. And then they just kind of become stronger to you. And I think what we're talking about now a little bit is like when either you choose or are forced to have an experience that puts you in a space where you're confronted with the other ones in a different way. And it's really important to seek those experiences out if it's not something that, because otherwise it's like you're just going to kind of focus on certain moral foundations your entire life. And it's if you're trying to really understand people, you need to seek out experiences that expose you to the other ones.
Absolutely. I think that's a really, really great insight. And it again connects back to what we were talking about earlier about confirmation bias, that exactly as you're saying, that we have this tendency to seek out things that are already in alignment with what we think, what we believe. And so if we have a tendency to lean in a certain way because we maybe had a set of life experiences, grew up in a certain culture, then we are going to continue to have that reinforced by the people that we encounter and live with and talk to, the kinds of information that we read, the media that we consume. And so it reinforces those moral foundations much more strongly. And so as you're suggesting, it's really important for us to try to, get curious about other perspectives, other ways of thinking and living to expand our knowledge and our horizon. And once we do that, it's interesting to see that our feelings and intuitions and moral foundations can change over time. So that's a really great insight. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, Rabia. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Do you want to share with the group?
Yeah, and that's fine. By the way, my name is spoken in many languages, so I'm used to different pronunciations. It's okay. I was the one who was sharing about theory versus the lived experience, because my feeling was that if my parents had not been physicians, I probably would have just believed whatever of science I read in books and not really seen how these things affect different people differently in practice and how there's so much variation. And I wanted to add to that I feel that we're somehow very much a culture of the word, that our beliefs crystallize around words, and only through experience do you get to understand how different concepts that you've crystallized or fixated on actually are different in practice. And I find that happening in my life. I seek out disconfirming experiences again and again. So how come these people who seem so much in theory like they're opposed to my values are actually the ones who show up when I'm sick or I need help or something like that? Or how come these people over here who feel like they're all very good people are sort of boxed into their own lives and I never see them, but I hear energy, and it's so it's very interesting to be able to interrogate our views about views, and about language and experience in general.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a beautiful insight. And yeah, really interesting how language can at times box us into thinking about things even more with more rigidity. So that's a really interesting point. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to share? Any insights or any questions about what we've discussed so far? Yeah, Stephen.
Well, I'm wondering where honesty and truth would fall, or does it span a number of these foundations?
Yeah, that's right.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Oh, because that's what I brought up in our the people want you to be honest, but they also want you to be loyal, which would fall under, of course, loyalty. But So tell me the truth, but then if you tell them the truth, then they're saying you're not being loyal.
Very interesting. Yeah, that's a great question. So the notions of honesty tend to they come from the Fairness Foundation, where fairness is about, again, like integrity, fair systems, and so honesty is connected to that idea, where we need to have honesty in order to, ensure that things are operating in a fair way. But yeah, what you're pointing out is really interesting, because again, it's highlighting this fact that very often these different values will be in tension with one another. And so it's really challenging to figure out how do you navigate that tension? What do you prioritize in which situation? So that's a great question. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions they want to share?
On that note, I was going to share a brief thing where I was working for the government, and it had to do with a fairness program, so to speak, of reaching out for citizen engagement. But there was, it wasn't working very well. So my job was to report that. And so, yes, so ironically, in trying to reach out and be fair, for the government to be fair and listen to people and so forth, I had to point out that it was not working quite well. And so kind of like the scale, when you had the people staying on the scale, they didn't want to hear it. Yes, you want to know, but you don't want to know. Right. So anyway, it ended up affecting my career a lot, and that was my life experience. So thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. And Pat, do you want to share something?
Well, I have a question just to build on Stephen's question about honesty. And I don't know what you would call it, but is there any kind of a map that takes a lot of different values and connects them back to these 6, a cheat sheet or whatever?
Yeah, I think we might have that somewhere, so I can look into it. But yeah, there's a whole list of how you can trace all the values back. So I can try to dig that up and share that with Elise. Yeah,
I'd love that. I think it would be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And any other thoughts or questions before we move on?
Jen has a question in the chat. She asks, what's the difference between morals and values?
That's a good question. I mean, there can be a very technical answer from like a philosophical perspective, but I'd say that for the sake of this conversation, it's more or less interchangeable, where, your values can reflect, again, like what you morally prioritize. So for the sake of this conversation, I'd say they're more or less the same, but the technical answer would be more around how values are attributes, whereas morals are more about kind of like precepts that can exist in a more kind of abstract form. I'm trying to think about how to say this in a useful way. I'd say that for the sake of the conversation, I don't think it's that important to get into the semantics of the differences. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on?
Andrew has a quick question, right?
Well, it's a comment rather, but in a way it could be a question. I'm thinking about dialogue, especially in the context of the fact that probably true dialogue and understanding the other points of the other perspective of the other person, you might reconsider or change in a way your own perspective. At least you understand that there could be more than one interpretation of a lived experience or what appears to be. So yeah, I mean, these are big blocks, but their interpretation could be very divisive, but through dialogue, we could understand that there is a lot of color which harmonizes all the different gradients of the same meaning. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that was a really beautiful description of, I think, what one of the most valuable goals of dialogue is. And what you're describing, I think, is a really important outcome of when you're having a dialogue where people are really sincerely listening and curious and trying to understand one another. I think that the outcome can be exactly what you're describing of understanding and unearthing that complexity of there are multiple ways of experiencing the world. There are multiple ways of thinking about these things. And our views might become more complex and nuanced after having those types of conversations. So yeah, I think that that's a great point. And let's see, is there anything in the chat? Timon, do you want to ask your question? And sorry again if I'm mispronouncing your name at all.
I know you're pronouncing it correctly.
Okay, great.
My question was just about working with young people and having these kinds of conversations. I'm wondering if you have any tips for how to make this something that you could do with that demographic of people, and something that is gonna, hold their attention. And
yeah, that's a great question. So that's a good transition, I'd say, to what I was going to share next. And so as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we work at Open Mind with people of all age groups and also in different contexts. And so the majority of the people that we work with are actually students, both in high school and in higher ed. So about 45,000 of the people who have used Open Mind are in those age groups of around 16 to 22. And so we also, though, work with companies and adult workplaces. And so the main tool that we offer is this online learning experience that includes 8 interactive online lessons that teach these same kinds of concepts, where they weave together psychological concepts with interactive examples and scenarios. And each of these lessons take about 30 minutes to complete. And so we have different versions of the program that are geared towards either a workplace or to a school environment. And so the program has been really well received in both communities. And one of the things that helps the program be well received is that it's very interactive and engaging. And so it's a personalized learning experience where essentially the learners are interacting with the program about every 30 seconds by answering questions, doing self-reflection, comprehension questions, these kinds of opinion questions, doing some kinds of like quizzes to understand something about their own psychology. So this is a tool we as a nonprofit, we offer our tools for free to educational environments. So students can use the tools for free, though we charge companies when they use it. And in addition to using the online program, we also offer this peer-to-peer coaching element, where essentially, in addition to the online lessons, typically what happens is people will use Open Mind in some kind of group or cohort, right? So in a school, it might be in a classroom. In a workplace, it might be with some kind of learning cohort or an onboarding group. And so what we do is we offer this opportunity for the group to be divided into pairs where people will meet one-on-one with their partner over the course of the program. And they will receive these structured conversation guides where they will have the opportunity to meet and work through a guide where they will reflect on the concepts that they learned online independently and asynchronously in this conversation. And the value of these peer-to-peer conversations is that it helps create accountability where, people will feel more compelled to actually complete the online lessons because they know that they have to show up for this conversation and participate and have learned the concepts beforehand. It also builds social connection between the partners because they engage in exercises similarly to the breakout that you all just did, where they're reflecting on their life experiences and starting to practice these skills. And then again, the last piece is that it starts to allow people to really put these skills into practice immediately in a structured environment. And to also share a little bit more about our work. So we are a research-focused organization. And when I say that, I mean that we are not just teaching psychological concepts, we're also rigorously evaluating the effectiveness of our tools on an ongoing basis. So we have these assessments that are built into the program at the beginning and at the end and afterwards to look at how are people changing over time. And what we found is that more than 70% of learners are less polarized after completing the program, meaning that they have more warmth towards those who differ from them after completing the program. we see that more than half of the participants also show an increase in intellectual humility, which is the willingness to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, the possibility of being wrong, which is really just a reflection of openness to new information, new perspectives, which is really important for decision making and also for communication. And then we also see positive things on feeling comfortable sharing your views. In addition, we see positive effects on things like perspective taking, what's known as dichotomous thinking. So dichotomous thinking is where you think in terms of, these extremes of like all or nothing. And so instead, people have more nuance in their thinking after completing Open Mind. And while the effects that I just shared are really focused on an individual and how they change, we also look at how do groups of people change after completing this program together, because our goal is that people complete the program as part of a group where they're gaining this shared language, shared set of skills that they can then refer back to over time. And so we see positive effects on outcomes on a group level as well, impacting culture. So, for example, we look at how do people's feelings of belonging within their particular group, let's say their workplace, change over time. And so what's encouraging is that we see that across the board, people show improvement in terms of their feelings of belonging after completing our program. But we see that people of color and women actually show an even greater improvement compared to their counterparts. So what you can see here, for example, is that starting off, there's a gap between people of color and white participants. And after completing the program, both groups improve, but the gap is starting to close between them, which is really encouraging. We also see that the program leads to increases in psychological safety within the group of people participating. So just to share a little bit more in case you're curious, the way that we typically work with workplaces is our program can be embedded into different types of programs. So the things that have been most common is that in some cases, companies will incorporate Open Mind into new hire onboarding. So they view this as an opportunity to create this kind of foundational training to help people gain this, again, shared language and set of expectations about how do we show up at this workplace? How do we communicate with our colleagues? And we really view Open Mind as a foundational training that gives people the skills to communicate about a whole range of challenging issues. The second main way that Open Mind is used is it's incorporated into leadership development training. So it can be in new manager training or other types of leadership development training. And then the last is that some companies include it on their LMS as just an offering that they'll have. And with that, sorry, Elise, I know I'm running a little bit late, so I'll just pause and hand it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you, Carolyn. So for those of you who came, I hope, getting to connect with moral foundations and how our experiences shift our perspective has been useful, that you've gained some new language with that, and that you go out and ask other people for their stories, right? Because the conversational skill to say, tell me a story about why this matters to you, is one of the best ways to start bridging those divides and broadening your perspective. And in talking about broadening our perspectives and learning from one another, again, we would love your feedback. So thank you for coming. The feedback form, for those of you who missed it earlier, is there in the chat. And then we will have for you resources from Open Mind, the edited recording, and all of that will be available here in the Meeting Innovation community later. And if you're interested in even more learning on completely different topics, please save the date. Next week, we are talking about creating hybrid workplace policies that are fair, just, equitable, and morally sound in all of the ways that they can be. And then we'll be talking about the metaverse in June. So lots of different opportunities to continue to innovate with us. And please, send your thank you to Carolyn for showing up and donating her time and her wisdom and her advice to us today. So
thank you so much. Great to be with you all.
For anybody who'd like to stay a couple minutes and just kind of reflect and ask the last couple of questions, we'll hang. But otherwise, we are officially done. So thank you.
I have another meeting, but thanks a lot, Carolyn. Really enjoyed it.
So glad.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
So Stephen has a question in the chat. He wants to know if open mind has been used by government.
Yeah,
like the White House.
Yeah, it would be great to be used in the White House. We've been used with local government so far, but yeah, we're interested in continuing to expand with government.
I know an aligned organization, so Braver Angels is now working pretty actively within the government as well, and that's very much dialogue skills along the same kind of fronts.
So it's actually, this is Steve Buckley. So they're having discussions about how to have better discussions. And that's, they seem to have a problem with that. This is not a new thing that started during the Obama administration under open government. That's the term, open government, how to be more open to people outside of government and have the humility to listen, when, even if though you're the expert, to listen to people outside of your box. But so anyway, yes. So there, it's how do you have humble conversations about how to have other humble conversations. So I'll put in my email address if anybody's interested in.
That's cool. I know one of the things we're seeing on the Braver Angels front is more call for conversational skills intra-party as opposed to across party lines. How do our Democrats talk to our other Democrats? How do our Republicans talk to our other Republicans? Because the divisiveness is really pretty stunning.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question about what's coming up. I had a conversation with Tim Wasserman, or Mike Wasserman, your staff. Yeah, and he mentioned that you might have to rebrand and that you're creating a new website, and just curious about how that's going.
Yeah, it's going well so far. We're working with a really great branding firm. So we're planning on announcing our new name and launching our new website by the end of the summer. So it's been actually a fun process.
Good, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. And Tiwana, did you have a last thought or a question?
No, I was just really curious about, well, I don't want to leave the space. And so I'm like, what questions do I have? And I can ask while I have her here. No, I was really just thinking about, the use of this with students. And now when you mentioned like schools and onboarding, I'm like, yes, at the beginning of the school year and with new staff and having common language. And I think it's amazing that it's free for educators, because we definitely need more free resources that will help us to build a better world for our young people and how they, I guess, will move forward in engaging with each other in the future. I'm running a leadership retreat next school year. And so I'm trying to gather up resources, and I didn't even think that I would find anything here to do with that. So I'm like, oh, this is great. So I'm really excited. And I'm just wondering how, for the 8 online asynchronous lessons, I was trying to think about how I could use those to, while I'm doing the retreats, but I'm not sure if we would have time to get through all 8. And I'm just wondering about the layout or setup of those, if they're like linear and I have to do them all in a row, or is there a certain time period, or how that works. But I could probably also go investigate the website and see. But if you have anything you can think of at this moment in time, it would just be like a day and a bit, I think, of a workshop with students, with high school students.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, when will it be? What month?
It will be at the end of September 30th, October 1st.
Okay, great. So we, right now our program is designed so that it's this like one experience, but we actually are releasing a new version that gives you that flexibility, exactly as you said, to pick and choose certain modules, and you don't need to go in a particular order. And it's the revised version is designed so that each of them can stand alone and build upon one another. So, so if you have a more limited schedule, you can use this new tool, and it will be released probably in July.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Congratulations. That's exciting.
Thanks. Yeah.
It's really hard, isn't it? Because like this kind of work really does take time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really does have to marinate. You really do need to practice, and yet nobody's what has time. They want the skills.
Yes.
The time, man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are there ongoing opportunities to practice? Because I went through this program with a group of people, and it's great to you just learn about it, but you don't learn it to the extent that you can actually use it in the moment.
Yeah, we're working on developing additional resources to continue that learning. We're still a young, small organization, so we don't have that already yet, but that's what we're working on building out now.
Barb, do you have a particular domain that you want to practice in? A particular kind of conversation?
Well, the domain I'm working in is training facilitators, because as facilitators, we need to recognize our own biases and the way we ask questions and the way we hold space for people who think very differently than us. So I'm just thinking, like, how do we help facilitators learn to be really curious in the moment, even when they're maybe triggered by what someone is saying in a group?
So there are a couple of resources that like on the political front where you can sign up for one-on-one conversations with somebody who disagrees with you and like schedule, so there are those kinds of things available. But I wonder, Barbara, if you'd like to, because I would love to do like a series of conversational practices with different methodologies on this, if you'd like to collaborate on that.
Yeah, I would.
Because I would love to do like clean language and and like a Chris Voss negotiation style sort of thing, and some of these kinds of skills, and like just have experiential opportunities to practice different ways of hearing other people's stories.
Yep. There's also NVC.
Yeah.
What's that?
NVC, nonviolent communication. Basically a way of well, their little formula is you observe things, then you express your feelings about it, and then how does this impact you, and then you make a request.
Right. So all of those formulas would be really fun to play with.
Yeah, I agree.
Elise, maybe there's an opportunity with Braver Angels. I know that they're looking for facilitators.
They absolutely are. And Zoom moderators and everything. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So by me, Barbara, I'd followed that up with Steve Warshaw. So if you know, so yes, where's the best to see? Braver Angels /
It's Oregon.
I don't have the link handy, but to point Barbara towards.
I'm aware of them.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Very cool. All right. Any last thoughts or questions, or heaps of gratitude to share?
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn, for coming.
Yeah, thank you. This has been fantastic.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to meet you all.
All right, everybody, have a fabulous evening, day, morning, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.